Thank you very much. Indeed, it's a pleasure to be here. I shall be offering one Christian perspective on assisted dying. The official position of most institutional churches in the UK and elsewhere is to resist the introduction of any form of AD legislation. Having said that, there is a spectrum of views on AD within the Christian family. Like other faith groups, churches have a voice in public debate, but they do not have a veto. According to the campaign group chaired by Rabbi Jonathan Romaine, Religious Alliance for Dignity in Dying, the principle of assisted dying is supported by people who belong to the Church of England, Church of Scotland, Church of Wales, Catholicism, Baptist Church, Methodists, URC, and more widely, Quakerism, Liberal and Reform Judaism, and Sunni Islam. Perhaps a fair comparison of the situation in which the churches are is that of the BMA. In the past, the official position of the BMA was to resolutely be set against the principle of assisted dying, though that position did not truly reflect the view of all doctors. Along with the Royal College of Physicians, the Royal College of Psychiatrists, the Royal College of Nursing, the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, the Royal Society of Medicine, the BMA has now dropped its opposition to AD legislation and adopted a position of neutrality. The Royal College of GPs, while still opposed, has an increasing weighting towards neutrality. So it is in the churches, including my own denomination, the Church of Scotland. We may hear official statements outlining the position of the Kirk as we know it, but that view, to this point at least, has not been inclusive of the spectrum of views held by Christians. At present, over 200 million people have access to a legally assisted death. These include New Zealand, Australia, 11 jurisdictions in the US, including Oregon and California, Switzerland, Spain, Canada, Colombia, and the Benelux countries. The BMA defines physician-assisted dying as a doctor's involvement in measures intentionally designed to end a patient's life. This covers, 1, where doctors would prescribe lethal drugs at the voluntary request of an adult patient with capacity who meets defined eligibility criteria to enable that patient to self-administer the drugs to end their own life. 2, where doctors would administer lethal drugs at the voluntary request of an adult patient with capacity who meets defined eligibility criteria with the intention of ending that patient's life. And the BMA defines eligibility as adults with mental capacity to make the decision, made a voluntary request, and they either have a terminal illness or serious physical illness causing intolerable suffering that cannot be relieved. Crucially, AD is voluntary and does not give doctors powers over life and death. As a spiritual person, the unnameable mystery we call God is central to my life. I hear echoes of that transcendence in the teachings of Jesus and others. For myself, Jesus embodies love, compassion, tenderness, forgiveness, dignity, respect, humanity, and humaneness. All of that is to the fore, and because of that, I am drawn to supporting assisted dying legislation, at least in some form, for those terminally ill who are mentally sound. For me, assisted dying legislation is centered on the relief of suffering, the avoidance of indignity, and the honoring of humanity. Compassion means to put yourself into the shoes of another, in this case, another who is suffering intolerably. There are numerous cases of intolerable suffering, including that of Heather Black, aged 69, in Edinburgh, whose horrendous death was witnessed over months by her daughters Victoria, Zoe, and Sarah. They spoke of the choking noise while their mother struggled to breathe each day, the awful smell as she vomited brown foam regularly, and at times tearing at her nightdress as if she was possessed. Heather was scared and desperately wanted to die. As others have done in similar situations, Heather asked her daughters to kill her. In the case of Richard Seeley of Perthshire in Scotland, who chose to go to Switzerland, he not only had to end his life prematurely, but had the indignity of saying goodbye to loved ones in an airport surrounded by happy holidaymakers. For those dying, there is clear evidence that once they have been given permission to have an assisted death, this brings peace, reduces anxiety, and improves the quality of time of life for the time remaining. It almost certainly extends life. Pastorally, many are not afraid of dying, but have a fear of a living death. Interestingly, you'll be interested to know that in 1937, a UK Gallup poll asked if doctors should be given the power to end the life of a terminally ill person. And in 1937, 69% of the British population said yes. In my view, there is nothing in the Christian scriptures which explicitly excludes the principle of assisted dying. I'm aware of scholarly work on voluntary deaths in the Hebrew and Christian Bibles, but what we are talking about now, in our terms, was not an ethical issue in the biblical period. In the Christian tradition, it may be said that the death of Jesus was a voluntary death, but theologically, it is not the same context as we are facing here today. Biblical texts may be stretched one way or another, but AD, as we understand it, was not their issue. We are bound, therefore, to consider themes, in this case, divine compassion. Some cite, certainly in my tradition, some cite, thou shalt not kill. In Hebrew, as I understand it, the commandment means, thou shalt not kill unlawfully. That's quite a difference. The first encounter Moses had with God is when God said, I have heard the cry of my people. The first words of God to Moses articulate compassion for those who are powerless, degraded, and suffering. Church of Scotland, my own tradition, accepts the principle of taking life. It commends the work of the armed forces, which do peacekeeping and at times kill. More generally, churches accept the theory of the just war. In civilian life, the church accepts the use of lethal force by police forces in certain circumstances under specific guidance. Of course, a person opting for an assisted death is not having their life taken away without their consent, but the point is that there are already circumstances when the churches accept the taking of life. Over the past 20 to 30 years, a number of prominent church theologians and leaders have spoken in favour of assisted dying. For me, the most notable is the Swiss-born Catholic theologian, the late Hans Küng. Once described, in Scotland at least, as the greatest living theologian, Küng supported assisted dying because in the 1990s, from the bedside, he endured the agonising death of his brother. In sometimes graphic terms, Küng wrote of organs failing, one after the other. As a theologian, Küng asked, is this the sort of death that God wants? He said the only answer that he had to be no. In the 1990s, Küng expressed very well a theology which supports individual choice. Other notable voices include the former Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, the former Archbishop and Nobel Prize winner Desmond Tutu, and Bishop Jean Robinson of New Hampshire, the first openly gay priest to be consecrated as bishop. Over the years, I have had many conversations with members of the wider church community who are opposed to assisted dying. What I've heard expressed is a fear of the slippery slope. of concerns over disability and abuse of legislation, but also quite reasonably a hesitation, not on grounds so much of faith, but on holding doubts about framing legislation carefully and concerns about ethical medical practice. The US state of Oregon has had AD legislation in place for over 2 decades and demonstrated that good legislation, sound professional practice are achievable. Religious leaders in Oregon have said that their society has not descended into dystopia, though that was predicted. Lord Kerry says that a compassionate society is one that has the courage to confront complexities. In Oregon, 0.5% of deaths are voluntary assisted deaths. I take the view that as more and more states and countries adopt AD legislation in some form, the more difficult it is to make some of the arguments against its introduction. Like others have said, we have to face the legal and moral nonsense that people in the UK travel abroad for an assisted death. This is a moral problem that the churches need to answer. One person every 8 days makes the journey to Switzerland to end their life. What is more, the option to travel to and from Switzerland typically costs around £10,000, which means it's an option for wealthier people. People of faith, individuals within faith communities, have travelled abroad for an assisted death. Clergy have supported people who have chosen an assisted death. Legally, families in England and Scotland have helped a loved one to travel to Switzerland, and though they have broken the law, they have not been prosecuted. We also need to be honest about the medical practice of double effect, which surely is disingenuous. Not my place to persuade a parishioner that they should or should not have an assisted death. Each of us must make our own decision. What I can do is offer my own perspective. I have lost count of the number of Christians who have encouraged me in public to publicly support the principle. Part of my motivation in supporting assisted dying is that I have been present with people who have had a death they would not have wanted for themselves. If we place ourselves in that room, so many times I have heard families say of their loved ones, she wouldn't have wanted this. This is not him. In a faith community like mine, part of my pastoral role is listening, deep listening, of being present with others in their suffering, and of course, tender, sensitive prayer. As a person of faith, I see the nature of this universe as a continual cycle of death and new birth. I speak to people of renewal in this life and life evolving beyond this life. Sadly, uncontrollable fear, indignity, and powerlessness are all part of such conversations. It does not need to be this way. Dignity, avoidance of suffering, and pain relief are the top reasons for requesting an assisted death. I do not think that the word suicide reflects the nature of an assisted death. It's a very loaded term. In Canada, the preferred term is medical assistance in dying, in part to avoid the word suicide. Terminally ill patients want to live. They are not suicidal. And if mental health ever becomes a factor, typically AD legislation excludes them from eligibility. Suicide surely is a personal and pastoral tragedy. It often stems from hopelessness and despair. Suicide tends to occur in isolation, perhaps through a violent act, and leaves families in great distress at the suddenness of the loss, their powerlessness, and sense of guilt. By contrast, an assisted death is not done in isolation, not done from a lonely place, and the person choosing an assisted death is surrounded by family and those they love, allowing them time to say goodbye. According to the Office of National Statistics, terminally ill people are more than twice as likely to take their own lives than the general public. In my view, we do have a say in the shape of our life and death. We get to choose many often in my tradition, we get to choose so many things and shape our lives. Christianity is committed to dignity in life for all people. The church's record in fighting injustice and poverty is considerable, and that concern for dignity does not stop at the very end of life. Some say that in choosing an assisted death, we are playing God. Well, I argue that is correct, and crucially, that is the way God wants it. We are made in the image of God. That means that through rational discernment, moral decision making, and our intuitive faculties, we are empowered to make decisions, including decisions of life and death. Whether it's organ transplant surgery, chemotherapy, DNR notices, relieving intolerable suffering at the end, or even taking a paracetamol, we are taking decisions God invites us to make. Are IVF births a desecration of life or a God-given source of joy? In the UK, 50,000 people a year avail themselves of IVF treatment. Pain relief in childbirth, it used to be banned. The church opposed it. Today, of course, that is not the case, and it will change. The law changed because Queen Victoria asked for pain relief. We are not puppets. We have free will, and we are to exercise that. In whatever ways we understand the soul, what constitutes a living being and the sacredness of life, still I suggest that God invites our moral decision-making. In the 1990s, supporting the principle of assisted dying, Hans Kung said, "We are co-creators with God." If people ever say that God chooses the moment of death, then the reply surely must be to ask, does God choose the suffering that goes along with that death? Does God choose violent deaths for adults or children? Does God choose how long one suffers? Hours, days, weeks, and months? Often it may seem that God is not so much prolonging life as prolonging death. In my view, it's morally difficult to say that God's ways are different from our ways. We cannot use the word God as a trump card. In faith, death is not the final word for us. Also, religious teaching has always evolved. It has changed many, many times over the centuries, and change, I hope, is coming in our thinking on AD. There is an irony that historically, the challenge for the early church was to stop people volunteering for an early death. In Christian tradition, we very much see our life and our death as a journey further into God, of entering more fully into God's ecstatic love. In facing his death by firing squad, the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer said of death, "This is the end, for me, the beginning of life." The 3rd century church father, St. Athanasius, said Christians treat death as nothing. They go eagerly to meet it, rather than remain in this present life. Could an assisted death be considered a noble death? The Oxford moral philosopher, the late Professor Richard Hare, suggested that no moral question has a greater bearing on the golden rule than the question of an assisted death to avoid indignity and intolerable suffering. 3 minutes. Thank you. In going forward, I hope that my own denomination, the National Church in Scotland, will adopt an inclusive position in which they warmly acknowledge a diversity of opinion within the Christian family. There are differences of opinion, and what matters is that we listen to one another with respect. The Church will almost certainly not come to a single view on this ethical matter, but I hope that we will be able to say that there is more than one perspective held by Christians and people of faith more generally. For me, AD is about dignity. Dignity means autonomy, participation in decision-making, the avoidance of anything that infantilizes or excludes, and the minimalizing of medication People generally do not want an institutional medicalized death. People are afraid of suffering. Life is more than a beating heart. I hope my own church will accept and respect differences of opinion. In conclusion, the UK is a secular and democratic society. As such, the government has a responsibility to all citizens. There needs to be space at the table for different voices. If someone does not wish to choose an assisted death, there will be no requirement to consider it. Arguments for and against need to be heard respectfully. Good medical practice means that once the legislation is passed, doctors will not be required to prescribe lethal drugs, only those who participate in the provision. It cannot be the case that one group of citizens is able to deny an assisted death to others simply because they are religiously, philosophically, or ethically opposed to it. Thank you.